Hi everyone, this is Ludmilla aka Mia, and welcome to Heart Mind Equation. So this is episode 5 of our CEN series. Today we are addressing recommendation number 2 related to our CEN, childhood emotional neglect. Recommendation number 2 is identifying our limiting beliefs consequently to the emotional neglect we were submitted to as a child, leading us to people-pleasing. And don't forget to go on my website, heartmindequation.com, to access worksheets I've put in place to accompany you throughout this episode. So basically, a belief is when we accept that a statement, a thought, or perception is true. We have trust, faith, or conviction in something or someone. Beliefs are influenced in a large spectrum by our family, our culture, and social conditioning, but also on the individual level by our experiences, observations, emotions, and most of all, by repetition. Beliefs that are influencing our behaviors the most are those rooted in our subconscious mind, about 90 to 95% of them. And our subconscious mind is primarily influenced by our limbic brain, responsible for initiating a cascade of chemicals resulting in different emotions. And there are two brain structures responsible for creating and sustaining our limiting beliefs. So first, we have the hippocampus for memory storage, and 2, the amygdala, which is an emotion regulator. Both structures work together to help sustain the neural networks related to the creations of our beliefs. Indeed, we can remember something better when we can remember how it felt, involving a correlation between our hippocampus and our amygdala. And you see, as everyone's pathway through life is different, we can say that there are as many more different beliefs as there are people. So the paradox is with the word belief itself, since it demonstrates simultaneously someone's conviction in a perception. In the case of people-pleasing habits related to our childhood emotional neglect, most beliefs about our self-perceptions are disempowering ones, becoming limiting beliefs. So it is relevant to say that a child who has experienced emotional neglect tends to develop limiting beliefs that reflect that emotional neglect he experienced growing up. More often than not, this child has a higher risk of becoming an adult with tendencies of people-pleasing, approval, validation, or attention-seeking. Unfortunately, most of the time, we can identify those limiting beliefs when we validate an emotional need we have that is being ignored by someone. Now, don't get me wrong, it is not anyone's responsibility to look out for our feelings or emotions. It is our own responsibility. And it's the way we interpret the negative situation that triggers our negative emotions. So there's the vicious cycle. First, we have the unpleasant situation that triggers negative thoughts. The negative thoughts lead to negative feelings or emotions. The interpretation of both the thoughts and emotions build a perception that we link to the situation. That perception draws a conclusion, and that conclusion becomes a limiting belief. Every time we face a similar situation or a similar context, that limiting belief actually get reinforced. our subconscious mind automatically recalled the emotion associated with the feeling we had back then. Sometimes it happens without us knowing it. Could be something very subtle, like a smell, a rainy day, a particular song playing, someone's voice, etc., recalling the neural network responsible for that negative emotion. In the case of emotional neglect, we can think of feeling unworthy, incompetent, insignificant, invisible, etc. Whenever we experience an unmet emotional need or get our feelings hurt for a reason or another, it often brings us back to the narrative we started to believe about ourselves as a child, whether we are aware of it or not. Here are some examples of limiting belief initiated by some of our childhood emotional neglect. So some kid would say or think, what I think or feel must not be important enough to share it with people. Or we have some other children that would think, we should never disappoint anyone if we want to be appreciated. Some other kids would say, well, if I gave my true opinion on this, I might get laughed at. We have other kids that would think, when you're a black kid in a white school, you should always do more than what's expected to be congratulated by the teacher, etc., etc. Now, how do we uncover the limiting beliefs related to our childhood emotional neglect? Not only from a parent growing up, but could also be from a sibling, our teachers back then, a friend, or peers at school. This is when we go as far as we can remember to recreate in our mind the unfortunate situation where we felt one of our emotional needs was being neglected or simply overlooked. We need to recall what happened, who was there, when it happened, where, why, and how. I call it the 5 WH questions. Again, the conclusions we make about that situation often becomes our limiting beliefs. So, here how it goes. Well, first, we recall the unpleasant situation or event where you felt that your feelings were overlooked using the 5 WH questions in the context of childhood emotional neglect. So who does it involve? Where were you at? When did that situation happen? What happened or what didn't happen? What were you expecting this person to do for you at the time? Was it to receive words of encouragement from a teacher? Was it to get support from your parents? Acceptance from your peers at school? To be nurtured or comforted by your mother? To receive help from a friend? Or to be validated about something you did? Or get approval from your team? Or simply to be seen or heard by the people you care about? And what was this person's reaction for you to think that your emotional need was dismissed at the time? And how did it make you feel? How did you perceive yourself then? And how do you think that person, that parent, sibling, teacher, teammates, or friend perceived you at the time? Why do you think you felt the way you felt about yourself? Then, about the situation or about the person? You see, most of the time, the perception we think someone has of us is often the perception we have of ourselves. We call it the mirror effect. That perception sets the first limiting belief regarding that situation. And the way we interpret the context of the situation often gets us to generalize the situation, usually based on family, social, cultural, and even generational conditionings. Unfortunately, most conditioning statements create limiting beliefs. Well, in my last podcast, I share with you one of my childhood memories. To recall the what, who, when, where, why, and how, here's the context. So between the age of 11 and 12 years old, when my parents were finally home on the weekends, I used to verbalize to them how I felt very sad and unhappy as a child. When my father asked why, I told him about my feelings, that I feel like I'm only used to help out in the house, take care of my younger sisters, and perform well in school. Told him about how sad I was about the fact that they never showed interest in knowing the real me. For my father, he would pay attention to me as long as I behave in a way to make him proud, for him to show off in front of other people. Unfortunately, both of my parents had the same attitude at the time. They both overlooked my unhappiness, always mentioning their parental sacrifices to raise us children, and how I should be grateful instead. They said that as I am the oldest child, it is expected of me to look out for my younger sisters and teach them a good example, which I can understand today. But then I could really recall the memory by easily remembering how insignificant my feelings were to my parents back then. The conclusion my immature mind came up with at the time was that my feelings and opinion were not important enough to be taken into consideration. So that was my limiting belief number 1. As my parents have emphasized the sacrifices they had to make to raise us children, I made another conclusion that was, what is really important is what you do for people. This limiting belief leads to people pleasing. Need to think about everyone else first before me. This other conclusion brought me back to limiting belief number 2, which was, if I do as I please, I am being selfish, and I resent being selfish. Based on my limiting beliefs at the time, I was always trying to live by the principle of doing what I should and not do what I want. Since I was a parentified kid at the time, I came up with limiting belief number 3, which was, making and keeping everyone happy is one of my responsibilities. Sadly, my people-pleasing behaviors were based on the misconception that everyone else was more important than me at the time. I wrongly thought that my people-pleasing was a way for me to feel that I mattered by doing for people what I thought mattered to them, as if it was more important to matter to people than to matter to me. And this is another limiting belief that is shared among many people pleasers who experienced childhood emotional neglect. Thankfully, I've come a long way since. I know today that the best way to be able to take care of anyone is by taking care of ourselves first. And it does not make of you a selfish person, only a wise person. Well, I'd like to suggest that you also identify the limiting beliefs that your childhood emotional neglects have triggered using the 5WH questions. You can even use my worksheets to complete the exercises. And after identifying our limiting beliefs related to our childhood emotional neglect, we need to overcome them. And this will be our recommendation number 3. So if this episode resonated with you in any way, feel free to share, like, or leave a comment below. For those of you who are watching from YouTube, if you haven't already, you can hit the subscribe button to get notified of our next episode. We'll be introducing a 5 steps method to disempower those limiting beliefs. Until then, you can still follow me on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube, or simply on my website, heartmindequation.com, to unlock hidden potentials.